By the summer of 1944, the Allied coalition appeared formidable on paper. The British Empire, the United States, and the Soviet Union commanded industrial output on a scale Nazi Germany could no longer match. Their armies stretched across continents, their fleets ruled the seas. Yet beneath this surface of power lay a quiet, persistent tension, one rooted not in strategy alone, but in experience. The Anglo-American alliance was strong, but it was not equal in confidence. Britain had been at war since September 1939. For nearly 5 years, British officers had fought, retreated, adapted, and endured. They had witnessed the collapse of France in a matter of weeks. They had stood on the beaches of Dunkirk with their backs to the sea, waiting under Luftwaffe attack for evacuation. They had absorbed the lessons of catastrophe early and painfully. Then came the Blitz. Night after night, British cities burned under German bombs. Civilians died by the tens of thousands. The war was no abstraction for Britain, it was a lived, daily reality. Beyond Europe, imperial confidence had been shattered. Singapore, once considered an impregnable fortress, fell in 1942. British forces were rooted in Greece and Crete. In North Africa, early campaigns exposed deep flaws in leadership and preparation before hard-earned victories slowly restored confidence. From these experiences, British commanders learned caution. They learned to distrust elegant plans. They learned that the German army, when properly entrenched and led, was lethal. Above all, they learned that optimism, untempered by reality, killed soldiers. Across the Atlantic, the American experience was very different. The United States entered the war in December 1941. Its armies were vast, well-equipped, and backed by unmatched industrial power. But they were also new. Many American divisions had never faced a modern European battlefield. Their officers studied doctrine, logistics, and combined arms warfare in classrooms and exercises, but lacked the institutional memory of defeat. To British eyes, this mattered enormously. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, respected American industry and energy. Privately, however, he doubted American judgment under fire. In his diary never intended for public reading, Brooke repeatedly expressed concern that American leaders underestimated German defensive power and overestimated the effectiveness of planning. This skepticism was not personal, it was cultural. British officers had been burned by assumptions before. The Americans, in British eyes, had not. At the political level, these differences became sharper. Winston Churchill, shaped by the disasters of Gallipoli in the First World War and the early failures of the Second, feared a frontal assault on Fortress Europe. The English Channel was narrow, yes, but its opposite sure bristled with concrete, steel, mines, and veteran German divisions. Churchill preferred indirect approaches. Strike the periphery, weaken Germany at the edges. Advance through the Mediterranean, apply pressure without risking annihilation. The Americans disagreed. General George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, believed in decisive concentration of force. To Marshall, prolonged peripheral campaigns only delayed the inevitable and bled resources. Germany, he argued, must be confronted directly in Northwest Europe. A cross-channel invasion was dangerous, but delay was worse. This disagreement defined Allied strategy through 1942 and 1943. Then came Tehran. In November 1943, the leaders of the Allied coalition met in Iran: Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin. By then, the Red Army had been fighting and dying on an unimaginable scale. Stalin demanded a second front in Western Europe to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. He did not ask politely. Roosevelt sided with Stalin. Churchill found himself isolated. Britain could advise, Britain could caution. But Britain could no longer veto. The invasion of France would happen. Operation Overlord was set in motion. On the surface, agreement had been reached, but beneath it, British unease remained. They trusted American resources. They trusted American courage. What they did not trust yet was American experience against the German defensive system in Western Europe. Nowhere would this tension be tested more brutally than at Omaha Beach. The American sector of the Normandy landings was assigned to U.S. forces largely because planners believed the Americans needed a decisive roll in, and because Omaha, while dangerous, was considered manageable. Intelligence assessments suggested German defenses there were weaker than on British and Canadian beaches. To British officers, this confidence felt familiar, uncomfortably familiar. As the invasion date approached, final briefings were delivered. Maps were studied, bombardment schedules refined. Timetables synchronized down to the minute. The planning was immense, complex, and on paper logical. Yet history had taught the British one unforgiving lesson: war does not respect paper. When the Allied Armada finally moved toward Normandy in early June 1944, it carried more than soldiers and equipment. It carried assumptions, it carried doubts unspoken. It carried a quiet question lingering in the minds of Britain's most experienced officers. Would American troops, untested at this scale, stand firm when theory collapsed under fire? If you're finding this deep dive into history valuable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps ensure these stories reach more people who want serious, thoughtful history told with care. The answer to that question would not be decided in conference rooms, or diaries, or diplomatic summits. It would be decided in the surf. It would be decided where planning ended and reality began. It would be decided at Omaha Beach. The invasion of Normandy was the most complex amphibious operation in history. It was the product of years of planning, thousands of staff officers, and millions of man-hours of preparation. Every phase of the assault had been calculated, rehearsed, and refined. Yet the plan for Omaha Beach, like all plans, rested on assumptions. And on June 6, 1944, many of those assumptions failed. Allied planners believed they understood the enemy facing them. Intelligence reports indicated that Omaha Beach was defended primarily by the German 716th Static Infantry Division. This formation was considered second-rate, composed largely of older soldiers, convalescents, and foreign conscripts pressed into service. It was assumed these troops lacked both the training and morale to withstand a determined assault. On that belief, the Americans were assigned Omaha. What the planners did not know was that the German 352nd Infantry Division had moved into the area in March 1944. The 352nd was not a static unit. Its soldiers were younger, fitter, and led by officers with Eastern Front experience, men hardened by years of brutal fighting against the Soviet Union. They understood defensive warfare. They understood how to kill attacking infantry efficiently. And they had spent months preparing overlapping fields of fire along the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. The intelligence failure was not total, but it was fatal in its consequences. Some reports hinted at increased German strength, but they were discounted or arrived too late to meaningfully alter the plan. Adjustments would have required reworking bombardment schedules, landing zones, and unit assignments, changes too large, too late, and too disruptive to implement. So the invasion went forward based on outdated assumptions. The second assumption concerned firepower. Omaha Beach would be softened by overwhelming force. Allied heavy bombers would pound German positions from the air. Naval guns would follow, destroying bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. By the time the first infantry waves landed, resistance would be shattered. The reality was very different. On the morning of June 6th, cloud cover hung over the Normandy coast. Bomber crews feared hitting Allied ships massed offshore. To avoid catastrophic friendly fire, many delayed their bomb release by seconds. Those seconds mattered. The bombs fell inland, beyond the beach defenses. The German fortifications' concrete casemates, reinforced trenches, and deeply dug gun positions emerged almost untouched. When naval gunfire began, it was intense but brief. The bombardment lasted roughly 40 minutes. Rear Admiral John L. Hull Jr., commanding the naval forces supporting Omaha, had warned that this was insufficient. He argued for a longer, heavier barrage to ensure the destruction of German defenses. He was overruled. The invasion timetable demanded speed, Surprise and momentum were prioritized over caution. The guns fell silent, and the infantry approached a shoreline that was far from neutralized. The third and most disastrous assumption involved armor. To support the infantry, 32 amphibious Sherman tanks, known as DD tanks, were assigned to Omaha Beach. They were designed to float using canvas screens and propel themselves ashore, providing immediate armored firepower against German strongpoints. In theory, it was an elegant solution. In practice, it was a death sentence. The sea was rough, 5-foot waves battered the landing craft. The DD tanks were launched to far offshore. As water poured over their flotation screens, the tanks lost buoyancy. One by one, they sank. 27 of the 32 tanks assigned to Omaha were lost. Their crews drowned, trapped inside steel hulls that became underwater coffins. The infantry would land with almost no armored support. By the time the first assault waves neared the beach, nearly every assumption underpinning the plan had already collapsed. The German defenses were stronger than expected. The bombardment had failed, the tanks were gone. Yet the timetable did not change. Landing craft approached Omaha Beach in tight formation. Inside them, American soldiers, many on their first combat mission, sat hunched under the weight of heavy packs, rifles clutched in trembling hands. They had been told resistance would be light. They had been told German defenses would be destroyed. They had been told speed was everything. None of that was true. As the ramps dropped, German machine guns opened fire. They had pre-registered the beach. They knew the distances. They knew where the obstacles forced landing craft to unload. Interlocking fields of fire swept the surf. Mortar fell among the waves. Artillery shells tore into clusters of men struggling to move forward. Some soldiers were killed before their boots touched water. Others stumbled into shell holes and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Radios, explosives, and flamethrowers sank into the surf, useless. Units disintegrated almost immediately. Officers were killed. NCOs went down. Men crawled, hid, froze, or ran without direction. Carefully organized assault companies became scattered individuals clinging to the shingle. Yet offshore, the full scale of the disaster was not yet understood. Commanders believed resistance would break once the first waves cleared the beach. Reinforcements continued to land into the same killing zones, casualties mounted with terrifying speed. What had been planned as a controlled assault turned into chaos. This was not simply bad luck. It was the consequence of planning built on assumptions about the enemy, about technology, about the ability of firepower to replace experience. And now, Omaha Beach was about to test not just American courage, but the entire Allied invasion. Because failure at Omaha did not mean a local setback. It meant the potential collapse of the Western Front before it was even born. At 8:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood on the bridge of the USS Augusta, staring toward the coast of Normandy through binoculars. From 8 miles offshore, the battlefield was distant, distorted by smoke and haze. But even from that range, the signs were unmistakable. Omaha Beach was on fire. Columns of black smoke rose from burning landing craft. Small explosions dotted the shoreline where artillery shells found their mark. Dark shapes, men, equipment, debris floated in the surf. What Bradley could not see were breakthroughs, organized movement inland, or the rising American flags he had expected to mark progress. Instead, he saw annihilation. The carefully timed assault waves had collapsed almost immediately. German machine guns swept the beach with mechanical precision. Mortar and artillery fired into choke points where American troops clustered behind steel obstacles and anti-landing barriers. The narrow strip of sand became a killing ground. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped, German gunners did not need to search for targets. They already knew where the Americans would be. Entire units were shattered in minutes. Company of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed directly in front of a fortified German strongpoint. Within 10 minutes, nearly the entire company was destroyed. Of the men who came ashore, approximately 96% were killed or wounded. Fewer than 20 reached the seawall alive. The company effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force before it had taken a single objective. Similar scenes played out along the length of the beach. Officers were hit almost immediately identifiable by their position at the front and the radios slung over their shoulders. Without leadership, men hugged the ground, pinned down by relentless fire. Some soldiers fired wildly, others lay motionless, unable to advance or retreat. The sea itself became an enemy. Men burdened with heavy packs stumbled into shell craters filled with water. Many drowned within sight of the shore. Others were cut down as they struggled to shed equipment and regain their footing. Medical personnel tried to help the wounded, only to be hit themselves. There was no continuous front, only isolated pockets of terror. Communication broke down completely. Radios were lost in the surf or destroyed by shrapnel. Units could not report their positions. Commanders had no clear picture of what was happening on the ground. The plan, so precise on paper, had dissolved into fragments. From offshore, Bradley watched the catastrophe unfold. Casualty estimates climbed rapidly. Reports when they arrived at all were grim. No armor had made it ashore. German defenses were intact. Infantry units were pinned down with no momentum inland. By mid-morning, the unthinkable began to take shape in Bradley's mind. Omaha might have failed. If the American forces could not break through, they risked being annihilated piecemeal. Continued landings would only add to the casualty lists. The beachhead could collapse under sustained German fire. Bradley faced a decision no commander wants to confront on the first day of an invasion: evacuation. He considered redirecting reinforcements away from Omaha toward Utah Beach to the west, or to the British and Canadian sectors to the east. Better to reinforce success, he reasoned, than to pour men into a killing zone. To abandon Omaha would mean admitting that the American assault had failed before it truly began. It would also carry enormous symbolic weight. British officers had doubted the wisdom of the operation. They had doubted American readiness. A collapse at Omaha would seem to confirm every private fear recorded in British diaries and staff meetings over the previous years. From the deck of the Augusta, Bradley could not see what was happening beyond the seawall. He could not see small groups of soldiers cut off from their units, without orders, often without officers beginning to move. But on the beach, something unexpected was happening. Not everywhere, not quickly, but in scattered, fragile moments. Small groups of men began to crawl forward, using shell holes and debris for cover. Engineers, many of whom had lost their equipment, used whatever tools they could find to breach obstacles. Infantrymen followed them up the bluffs, inch by inch, exploiting gaps in German fire. These were not coordinated assaults. They were acts of survival. Men advanced because staying where they were meant death. They moved not for glory or doctrine, but because forward, however dangerous, was the only option left. German defenders, trained for repelling a coordinated assault, struggled to respond to this chaos. Their fire plans were precise, but inflexible. When Americans appeared in unexpected places, small cracks began to open. Still offshore, Bradley did not know this. He knew only that Omaha was consuming men at a terrifying rate. That the assault, as planned, had collapsed. That his decision could shape the fate of the entire invasion. This was the moment British skeptics had feared, a moment when optimism met reality and reality answered with blood. If Omaha failed, the Western Front might fail with it. And if that happened, the war in Europe would be prolonged at an unthinkable human cost. If you're finding this account meaningful, please remember to like the video and subscribe. It helps ensure these stories of sacrifice and decision reach a wider audience who value serious, accurate history. The outcome of Omaha now rested not on grand strategy, but on whether enough men on that beach could keep moving long enough for history to tilt in their favor. From the bridge of the USS Augusta, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley could see smoke, fire, and wreckage, but he could not see the fragile turning point unfolding on Omaha Beach. He did not know that the battle, though still hanging by a thread, was beginning to change. On the sand below the bluffs, The American assault no longer resembled any plan conceived in London or Washington. Units were shattered beyond recognition. Men fought alongside strangers, following whoever happened to be moving forward. Rank, doctrine, and timetable had dissolved. What remained was will. Small groups, sometimes no more than 2 or 3 men, began climbing the steep, grass-covered slopes above the beach. They used shell holes, hedges, and folds in the terrain for cover. German fire still cut them down, but not fast enough to stop all of them. These movements were invisible from offshore, but to the German defenders, they were alarming. The defenses at Omaha were designed to stop a frontal assault. Machine gun nests, artillery, and mortar were oriented toward the beach itself. When Americans began appearing on the flanks and rear of strongpoints, the carefully prepared fire plan began to unravel. German units were trained, disciplined, and experienced, but they were few in number and stretched thin. Communication lines were cut. Commanders struggled to determine where the Americans were breaking through and where the lines still held. What emerged was not a sweeping breakthrough, but a slow, uneven erosion of German control. Engineers cleared narrow exits off the beach. Infantrymen silenced individual bunkers with grenades and rifle fire. In some places, German defenders withdrew to secondary positions. In others, they fought to the last. By early afternoon, scattered American forces had reached the high ground overlooking Omaha. The beach was no longer entirely under German observation. Reinforcements, once pinned helplessly in the surf, could now land and move inland, still under fire, still at great cost, but no longer trapped in a killing zone. The moment of total collapse had passed. Omar Bradley never gave the evacuation order. The decision he had weighed whether to abandon Omaha became irrelevant, overtaken by events he could not see but would soon understand. Reports began to filter in, isolated breakthroughs, enemy positions neutralized, movement beyond the bluffs. Omaha was not a victory, it was survival. By nightfall on June 6th, the American beachhead at Omaha was shallow, fragile, and soaked in blood. Casualties numbered in the thousands. Entire companies had ceased to exist. The cost was far higher than planners had imagined and higher than many British officers had feared. Yet the beachhead held, and that fact carried meaning far beyond the sand and cliffs of Normandy. For years, British commanders had quietly questioned whether American forces, new, confident, and largely untested at this scale, could endure sustained, catastrophic fire without breaking. Omaha provided the answer. Not through flawless execution, not through superior planning, but through refusal to collapse when everything went wrong. Montgomery had sensed this quality during his visits to American camps before the invasion. He noted their belief in the mission, their confidence that the war could and must be ended decisively. On Omaha Beach, belief alone did not win the day, but it prevented defeat. Coalition warfare is fragile. It depends not only on shared goals, but on trust built slowly, often painfully. At Omaha, that trust was forged not in success, but in disaster endured. British skepticism did not vanish overnight, nor should it have. Omaha exposed deep flaws in Allied planning, intelligence, and coordination. It demonstrated how close the invasion came to failure, but it also demonstrated something equally important. Catastrophic error did not automatically mean defeat. The Allied war effort did not fracture under the weight of its own assumptions. It bent, nearly broke, but held, and from that precarious foothold in Normandy, the Western Front grew. Within weeks, Allied armies were pouring into France. Within months, they were at Germany's borders. The road was still long, and the cost still terrible, but it ran through Omaha Beach. History often remembers D-Day as a triumph of planning and precision. Omaha tells a different story. It tells of miscalculation, doubt, and the razor-thin line between failure and survival. It reminds us that victory is sometimes born not from brilliance, but from endurance. When ordinary men refuse to accept the moment, history seems to turn against them. On that narrow strip of sand, under a sky choked with smoke, the question Britain had quietly asked for years, would the Americans stand under fire, was answered. It was answered in blood.